On this edition of FedGov Today, the FedRAMP evolution will impact every agency.
As that program evolves and those responsibilities get offloaded to federal agencies, it's really important for them to focus on these things that we looked at these four agencies.
Dave Hinchman of the GAO will tell you more on FedGov Today in just a moment. Uniting program strategy, advanced technology, process, and execution for a more efficient government. That's Maximus. Every program, every service, every time. That's innovation forward. Learn more at maximus.com/federal. Four agencies in the federal government are hitting varying degrees of success in securing their cloud computing environments. The four agencies the Government Accountability Office studied are the State Department, Transportation, the VA, and the Small Business Administration. Dave Hinchman's a Director of Information Technology and Cybersecurity at GAO. Dave, welcome. It's great to have you back on the program. How did you choose these four agencies to look at in terms of what they're doing security-wise in the cloud? Welcome.
Sure. Well, first of all, Francis, thanks for having me and really appreciate the chance to talk about my team's work. Without boring your audience, we essentially look at the number of existing cloud authorizations that are out there and broke those out into several tranches and then selected two agencies from each of those tranches, sort of above and below the mean of how many authorizations agencies had. And then within each agency, we asked them to nominate nominate both a platform as a service cloud deployment and a software as a service cloud deployment, with the condition that each of those deployments covered multiple services within the agency so that we knew we were looking at a fairly complex deployment.
Overall, is there a thread among what you found at the four agencies and relative to what you wanted to look at as you took this work on?
Yeah, I think the thread is unfortunately that there's a lot of work to be done. This is a report we did that's similar to work we did several years ago where we looked at systems that were managed by agencies themselves. And we found similar problems with looking at continuous monitoring of cyber controls. We found problems with service level agreements that weren't fulfilling their intended purpose, which is really, in this case, governing the relationship that an agency has with a cloud provider. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity for folks to look at this and say, hey, let's look at ourselves, let's look at our cloud deployments and make sure that we are doing everything we need to ensure our cybersecurity.
And normally what I would do is walk through this with you or your colleagues about what you found individually in each organization or whatever. But what you just stated, Dave, is the purpose that I really wanted to get to with this conversation rather than what happened at the State Department or Transportation or VA or SBA. What should agencies learn from this about what they need to look at relative to their cloud deployments? And I'm talking, as you looked at, from beginning to end, not just pieces here and pieces there.
Sure. So I'll even take it a step further back and just sort of to set the stage for why this is so important for your audience. Cloud use in the federal government is booming right now. We think it's about $10 billion a year spend. I think that's probably a likely number. The number keeps going up. And so as agencies go to move their systems in the cloud, which provides them economies of scale, it provides them efficiencies. There's a strong argument that the federal government doesn't need to be building and operating these complex systems themselves. Let's get those folks focused on mission and when we have these skilled technical providers out there. And so with that rise in cloud, you got to make sure you're doing it right. And that starts from day one so that when you build that contract with the provider, from the very beginning, you've clearly established the roles and responsibilities in that relationship. You've established what the service provider needs to be doing to ensure cybersecurity, but then also the agency needs to understand what it's doing, that it's reviewing the security logs from the provider to look for things. And then there's also, of course, ensuring that everyone's compliant with reporting requirements for incidents, as well as federal contracting regulations. And I think that our brief look at these 8 systems at 4 agencies that we found as many consistent challenges as we did, I think says a lot about what we might find if we were to look at every cloud deployment across the government.
If you were going to put these challenges that you just described into categories, and again, not keying them on these particular agencies, but more broadly across the government as what should we look at so we don't wind up with the same issues, what categories would you put these issues into, Dave?
I think I would roll them all up into one. And I think it's understanding what it means to have a cloud system operated by a vendor. And I think that all too often agencies rush into the cloud. And I think me talking to you in the past, I've used the phrase, cloud for cloud's sake.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not really understanding that this is something you've offloaded to someone else. They go off, they take care of it. You're still the one paying the bills for this. And so as the federal government, we have an obligation to ensure that the service provider is giving the American taxpayers everything that they're being paid for. And I think all too often, folks don't really understand that. They don't have clear communication with the vendor, and then that communication channel runs both ways, so that you get into these situations where you don't have good service level agreements, or you don't have the continuous monitoring of cyber controls that needs to happen. And those holes are how bad things can happen, because that's how bad guys find their way into systems.
Mm-hmm. What are the key practices that you list in this report that are either, or maybe both, the key practices that you saw lacking the most, both in this work and in other work, similar work that you've done, and or that would be the easiest way for agencies to get themselves either back on track or to stay on track by continuing to drive those key practices?
So there are three things we looked at: continuous monitoring, incident response and recovery, and service level agreements. And I've talked a lot about continuous monitoring and service level agreements, and I would focus on those. For continuous monitoring, it's the vendor that's doing the work, but then the agency has an obligation to review those logs and results to make sure you understand what threats are hitting your system or not your system, but your vendor system where your data is, so that you understand what that is and that everything you have is being adequately protected. And I think that's a practice that is challenging and daunting, but it's just basic cyber hygiene that can be put in place that would make a big difference. And service level agreements, that starts from day one. When you enter in this contractual relationship with a cloud provider, the service level agreement literally establishes the parameters for performance metrics. What can you expect from the vendor? What can the vendor expect from you? What are the service levels that need to be provided? What are the remediation plans that go into effect if you find a discrepancy? And that's something that I think is important for any procurement in the federal government, but doubly so for cloud, where people are trying to look for ways into agencies to get after data, and cloud is often a way they do that.
Are there items that agencies should be looking at in SLAs and at least making sure they understand that maybe they're not doing to the maximum extent that they could?
I think performance metrics is probably the big one that I would focus on. That's something the government struggles with traditionally. We often don't define performance metrics well ourselves for our internal agency performance. And so that carries over when you're establishing this contractual relationship. But it's defining clear, concise, measurable metrics that indicate whatever level of performance you wanted to monitor, right? The performance metrics can be about whatever matters to you as an agency, but you want to make sure you defined it the right way, that you can track it, you can measure it, and that it's really giving you a good health check on whatever functionality you're monitoring.
Moving forward, there's a number of recommendations here, and we'll link this work on the show page at fedgovtoday.com so folks can see the dot the I's and cross the T's themselves. But broadly, the recommendations that you make here, do they fit with what we've already talked about here? Or are there other recommendations that you would want these agencies to take a look at?
No, we took a very tactical approach on our recommendations for this approach. And if your readers go in and open up our report, you'll see a lot of slick graphics that our folks put together that really highlight our findings and allow you to both get a summary view as well as a drill down. For every practice that we found wasn't complete, we made a recommendation to address that.
You do a lot of work across the federal government. And I'm not going to ask you, well, maybe I am, but I don't mean to ask you to speak outside the scope of your work on these four agencies. Did what you found in looking at these four agencies sync with what you've seen as you looked more broadly across the federal government?
At the risk of generalizing, which I hate to do that because this is a limited data set, which I think is super important to acknowledge. These are 2 cloud deployments at each of 4 agencies we looked at. There's so much more cloud out there. But I think that based on this and other work we found, and just looking at our work has shown to be general challenges, right? In terms of locking down these security controls. Cyber's a really tough thing. And we're backfitting cyber in so many systems because the systems have been around a long time, but the threats are new. So trying to figure out how to keep pace with developments in cyber technology and sort of slap that back on the solar system where maybe it's a little more challenging, a little more work involved, I think really highlights the need for everyone everywhere, all hands effort. We all need to pay attention to what we're doing with cyber controls and making sure that we've got things as safe as we can make them.
One of the things that strikes me that makes this work especially important too, Dave, and for other agencies to pay attention to it, is the fact that the administration is pushing commercial as much as it possibly can. And so all of these as a service systems will become, I imagine, more important in agency operations, and there will be more of them over time as agencies decide, okay, we should really listen to what they're telling us to do and buy more as a service rather than trying to create it ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. And I would also bring in something we haven't talked about, which is the federal government's look at ensuring cloud security through the FedRAMP program, right? Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program. It's designed to ensure safe cloud deployments by looking at vendors. That program's evolving. And where there used to be a central function that looked at the security of each specific cloud deployment a vendor wanted to put out there, that responsibility is being offloaded to agencies now. So they need to look at the vendor, what the vendor is providing. They need to make sure that they're doing their due diligence to ensure that what's being put, where their data is being put, is safe and secure as possible. And so as that program evolves and those responsibilities get offloaded to federal agencies, it's really important for them to focus on these things that we looked at these four agencies. And again, as I mentioned, in our limited look, we only found one agency that had done everything they needed to for both their systems, and that was Department of Transportation. But that just shows that there's, I think, a lot of work to be done across the government.
You note transportation. And one of the challenges potentially in the community broadly, not necessarily at transportation, but I think of it because we learned that Pavan Padugu, the chief information officer there, is leaving. So my mind then immediately goes to CIO and other leadership churn as potentially a challenge for addressing some of these issues, Dave.
Yeah, I as soon as you brought that up, I thought back to how long we've been reporting on challenges with CIO tenures. And it goes back probably more than 15 years. And it continues to be a problem. And that's regardless of administration. This is just something that's there. And yes, when you start having staff turnover, that's when things can fall through a crack. CIO A has this vision and a plan for what they're doing. Whatever happens and that person leaves, is that all being passed off to the folks who stay? And do they have the same vision? And are there going to be gaps that are going to be missed? And so I think that's a really big part of the equation.
Dave, it's always great to talk to you. Thanks for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me here, Francis. Great to talk to you as well.
You can find a link to Dave's work on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. New employees at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency will take AI and data management training as part of the process for onboarding at the agency now. The Associate Director for Operations at NGA, Rear Admiral Michael Baker, says current employees will get training too. Michelle Atten, the Chief AI Officer at NGA, will tell you how the agency's training those employees and how those employees will use the training they get on FedGov Today TV. You can watch it now on demand at fedgovtoday.com and the FedGov Today YouTube channel. The next FedGov Today podcast is coming Thursday. I'm Francis Rose. I'll talk to you then. Thanks for listening.